welcome all of you and also Professor Frode Steen for this talk. About 2 weeks ago, he gave another talk here in the university, which was more focused on the 2 or 3 different interdisciplinary areas that he has been working on. And the intent of the talk was to highlight and give examples of how collaborative interdisciplinary research is being done by teams he is part of. Today's talk, I think, is going to focus more on a very specific theme within that broad framework. As the invitation for the talk says, the title of the talk is Verbal Skepticism and Visual Gullibility. He will explain, hopefully at the end of the talk, we will all be very clear what that means. Professor Steen is a member of the Faculty of Communication Studies in UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. And he's here for 2 months, till the end of this month actually, in Azim Premji University as a visiting fellow.
Okay, is the sound on? Is that right? Right, so the background for the type of arguments I'm going to make today is that there are 2 topics. I wasn't quite sure whether the internet connection would be good, so I've sort of modified the talk a little bit. The 2 topics are related in the sense that they both have to do with how does news communicate, what kind of information do the news communicate. And it turns out this is very hard to study. Almost all of the work that's done in communication studies on systematic study of the news is done with the text. It's basically done with the analysis of newspapers. Newspapers can be stored in large databases. You could do searches, do qualitative and quantitative work on it. And in contrast, the challenge faced by televised news has proven so prohibitively labor-intensive that in practice there's very little work on it. That doesn't mean that people don't think that television news is, in a sense, really what we would like to understand, and a sort of dominant channel in the public debate. Right? In a sense, it's the modern public sphere. Even more so, I think, in the West than in India. Right? In India, my sense is that newspapers still have a strong position. This is less and less true in the West. Right? People read newspapers less and less, and the airwave television is basically taking the audiences. But the dominant form of news in the US and much of the West for the past couple of generations has been television. It's not because people didn't think it mattered that it hasn't been studied, but because it was hard. Now, there are a couple of reasons why it's hard, right? So one reason is that we haven't had the tools to search, right? We haven't had tools for systematic visual search. So we haven't been able to aggregate information, pull up patterns from large-scale databases. The other reason is that the kinds of theories that people had about how news works, right, and how the human mind understands news has been largely based on the theory that people think in words. And that images get translated into a kind of internal mental representation that is symbolic and language-like. Right? This is known as the linguistic turn in philosophy. Started, 3 generations or so ago, right? Wittgenstein, and even a little earlier, and has dominated cognitive science for at least since the 50s, right? Basically, beginning of cognitive science. It's been a dominant theory. Part of what I'd like to open up today is a model that suggests how we can begin to think about cognition that doesn't assume that everything is being translated into something like language. Now, if you look at a television broadcast like this, one of the things we've done, right, is to develop a video annotation tool. And this is just an example of some of the dimensions that you could use to...
Hillary Clinton says the U.S. is losing an information war to foreign media outlets, including RT. This week, the Secretary of State asked Congress for more cash to step up America's efforts in Washington.
War declared. The U.S. is now officially in an information battle with foreign media, which provide alternative views on world news. Views which often run in contrast to the coverage of events by the U.S. mainstream media. We are in an information war, and we are losing that war. I'll be very blunt in my assessment. Al Jazeera is winning. The Chinese have opened up a global English language and multi-language television network. The Russians have opened up an English language network. I've seen it in a few countries, and it's quite instructive. We are cutting back. The BBC is cutting back. Some 5 years ago, Western media outlets, including BBC and CNN, had a near monopoly in the coverage of world news. Things have changed since then. More and more viewers across the world tune into various foreign media to get a fresh take on events.
Clearly, the United States feels on the defensive, in part because...
Now, so when you watch this, right, there are a couple of things to note. So one point is that audiences get this kind of stuff very easily. In fact, people relax by watching television. So veg out, right? They find it something that requires, very little effort, right? But imagine trying to put a computer in front of this broadcast and figuring out what's going on. In fact, that is far beyond, this is part of the project I talked about last time, right? We have a well-funded project to do this for 4 years. But this is extremely complex, right? Far beyond the current capabilities of, artificial intelligence and so on, right? Now, if you look at the different channels that are being used for the, let's see if I can just take this back a little bit. So, if we look a bit at the, I have enough control to really do this. Let's just freeze it there for a moment, right? So, when you see a person, right, the television taps into cognitive capacities that are ancient. It's not as if television needs to completely invent its audience. Right? So when you see something like this, a lot of television is faces, right? It's talking heads. Right? And the human mind has millions of years of evolved special equipment for understanding faces, picking up tiny details, reading very sensitively, very rapidly. Right? So that when you see something like this, part of what a politician is trained to do, and we know this, right, is they are trained to present a certain appearance of emotions, of urgency, of concern, of care, the whole sort of repertoire of emotions that is considered in a particular culture appropriate for a politician. And one of my colleagues has done studies on stone-faced politicians. Right? They tend to do poorly, right? Just because they don't deliver the kind of sort of multimodal emotional communication that audiences want to be able to relate to. The medium through which audiences make this distinction, right, between the stone-faced politicians and the expressive ones is, of course, through television. Television gives you upfront, close, intimate look at people. To the point where the kind of politicians that can get elected now in the US is a very different class of people from the ones who could be elected prior to television, prior to constant, up close, in your face. Right? People simply will not elect people who they don't consider reasonably good looking, someone that they want to see on television all the time. It's slightly tongue in cheek, but it has a strong effect on your ability to communicate emotion, to be likable, and to sway people at this very basic level. Now again, this is not something television invents, right? These are ancient cognitive adaptations that television taps into. Now, television's ability to communicate at several channels at the same time also means that, in addition to the facial expression, right, we also look at gestures. Right? We can listen to the sound, and all at the same time, we even have text. Right? So our minds get bombarded by television to the point where it's very difficult to have thoughts, sort of, simultaneous thoughts to what is being bombarded at you. Right? In other words, if you think of reading, right, even if you speak to someone, there is spare capacity to resist the message. Right? If you try to convince me of something, I have spare capacity to say, he is pulling my leg, he is arguing in his own interests. Right? I can be skeptical, or I can think, well, he's a very reliable person, but maybe, this other guy, I can't quite, rely on everything he says, right? He doesn't know this area, something like that, right? If you watch television, basically your whole bandwidth tends to just get taken up. Right? In the sense that, and you can experiment with this yourself, right? That the ability to, in a sense, resist what we're seeing on television is far less than the ability we have to resist a verbal argument, right? Where we are quite sophisticated. Now, so one aspect of this is sort of understanding the communicative power of television, right? Another dimension of this, I don't know how deep I should go into it. Pick one of them. Great news report, right? Just Fox News.
We are getting confirmation that it was a bomb, or maybe more than one bomb, that caused this explosion. We're hearing again reports, unconfirmed reports of people dead.
Okay, so it's a bit.
Injured and maybe others trapped. The blast tearing through a number of buildings, including one that houses the Prime Minister's office.
Yeah, so it's a little bit jumpy, but we get the idea. Now, if you look at this picture, you have multiple things going on at the same time. Right? And again, people don't have any difficulties getting this. Right? So part of what we're seeing with television is we have massive bandwidth. We're capable of doing massive parallel processing. In contrast, words are serial. Right? They get delivered a little bit at a time, and really far below typically what we're really able to process in terms of information. Now, the other point here is that the words have to be decoded. Right? The meaning has to be extracted. Right? What we're seeing with television is that television appears to be closer to the native representational format of the mind. So in other words, the necessity to translate this into something else may not be there. I'd be happy to explore this a little further with you. Right? Because this is, of course, the opposite of what the kind of linguistically oriented cognitive theories have been asserting for a long time. But I also want to point out here that what you get here is the sort of composite experience of someone speaking to you and telling you a story. Some of that story you have to imagine yourself because she's talking about things that aren't happening on the screen. But at the same time, you get the experience here of field footage. And the field footage is, of course, presented from a particular camera angle. Now, in order for the mind to make sense of field footage, you have to sort of map yourself, map your eyes, as it were, onto the lens of the camera. Does that make sense? In other words, in order to make sense of this scene, right, your mind has to construe that as if you were standing where the person who actually took the picture was standing. Right? But by implication, that is where you're looking. Right? Now, this is a very powerful experience because it means that suddenly you are, at some cognitive level, inside the picture. Right? And given that, that means that there's a great deal of control from the production team's point of view to what type of experience and what type of response you are going to have to a particular scene. Right? So that if you have a scene like this, which is filmed with a cell phone, right? In this case, this is not professional footage. Right? It gives you this very sort of vivid sense of being there. Now, this is in some sense an experience that almost seems unmediated, right? As if you're just seeing the facts. Right? It's far more powerful than a story that someone tells you realize could be wrong. It's much harder to say that television is lying. Right? The impulse here is to simply treat that as an experience. Now, I want to take this a little further and look at the type of what we could call thinking or information processing that goes on when we watch the news, right? And what that tells us about how the mind works more generally. Right? So in other words, the news is going to be processed in a certain way. We can see the structure, the news is outward, right? It's tangible, it's physical object, right? Put it that way. But the way the news are structured tells us something about how the mind wants information. Now, at some level, of course, the news tells us what happens, right? Provides us facts. And it's in a sense what we would sort of reasonably expect of the news, right? Good news will tell us what really happens, will give us the facts. But the surprising thing is that much of the news isn't really facts, right? We'll listen to this a little bit, and you can consider what aspects of what's being said and shown are facts, and when do you go beyond that, and why do we go beyond it, right?
We have confirmed through media reports in Norway that he is saying he was working from home, apparently, according to these reports. But now we're also hearing, as I mentioned, that this may not be over. Not only may there be people trapped in this bomb science, but there may be other bombs as well. Police are trying to look into all these different leads. Great work, Israel Live from Rome, with the very latest, Greg.
Okay, so one of the things that you heard that was what we call a type 1 possibility, right? Which is the anchor is faced with an uncertain situation. Right? So you have imperfect knowledge. Some of this knowledge is sort of very straightforward and factual. Right? It's knowledge like how many people died. Were there several bombs that went off? Was there a bomb, or was it a gas explosion? Was it an accident? And then the second level of the inquiry into fact, right, is essentially about intentions. So let me switch to my slide for a moment here, so just sum that up a little bit. I'm going to skip a few slides. Since I have the visuals here, we can skip over some things. So, you know the story from Sherlock, right? The dog that didn't bark. And this some kind of bounce here. Is this good enough? So the point here is that on the basis of facts, we can make certain types of inferences, right? And the facts may be, they are in a sense connected to a larger model. Right? So you have a model of reality where the fact that something doesn't happen becomes significant. In itself, it's nothing. Right? In a sense, it's sort of surprising that something that doesn't happen has meaning. Right? But the reason it has meaning is that the meaning emerges out of this complex network of a mental model where a lot of elements are tied together. And part of what this mental model contains is causal theories. So one of the theories would be, if a stranger approaches a dog will bark. The dog doesn't bark, and it means we can infer something about who was approaching the dog. That's what Sherlock Holmes is doing. Now, even in the task of determining the fact, you have to draw on these complex mental models. Right? You can't simply observe everything. Right? You simply don't have access to it. So what the kind of classic model of the detective or the fact-finding journalist, right, is nothing but the facts. Right? All we want are the facts now, right? And we'll sort of slowly uncover those, right? But there are a couple of reasons why the news don't work this way, right? One is that the sort of raw facts that you have immediate access to provide only a small part of the picture. So let's say you wouldn't be a journalist if all you could report was there's broken glass on the street, person X, right? This man is running around the corner. This isn't news. What you expect of a journalist is to tie together these news into a complex narrative that has an overall meaning. Right? One aspect of this is what we call causal reasoning. Right? It's essentially if you see that something has happened, you can reason from that because these kinds of effects tend to come from certain causes. Okay? So you can make inferences based on the little bit you know. And very high quality work has been done on this by Judea Pearl. The problem of understanding causality is actually ancient. Right? If some of you have taken philosophy, you'll know Hume's problem of induction, right? Or Popper's falsifiability thesis and so on. Right? So this whole debate about how we determine that something causes something else is a very old philosophical debate. Pearl argues that the way in which we find that something is the cause of something else is by intervening in the system. We have to actually do something, and by changing a particular variable and then controlling what effect that has, we can assign cause to it. Right? Now, in the news, of course, we don't have the luxury of building these causal models from scratch through controlled experiments. Right? What instead people rely on, and we'll see this not just journalists, but audiences, right? They rely on pre-existing, prior theories of causality. Right? So that, for instance, when we have a blast, people have prior theories that blasts are caused either by bombs or by leaking gas lines. Right? It's not caused by someone eating an apple or because you run a letter to your grandmother. Right? That doesn't cause it. buildings to explode. Everyone knows that already, right? So we have these huge models that say certain things cause other things, right? Integrated models. And when we see a little bit of evidence, the way the things work is that then all of these mental models get activated. Now, it's not always clear which model should be activated, but typically the journalist, right, has access to a very small part of the fact, and then they will activate these mental models that will generate hypotheses about what else could be facts. Yeah. So that's the first use of the possible. Right? Basically, recruiting the notion of the possible as a way to determine what is the fact. Right? So you have imperfect information, you use the possible to generate hypotheses about what may be the fact. Now, it turns out this is a great part of the news deals with these kinds of possibilities. So, at the level of material causes, right, you have the fact that there's a blast, allows you to infer that there must have been a bomb, the kind of causes that can be responsible for blasts, right? But the material cause is not sufficient for the news story, right? You can't simply say, oh, it was a bomb. That's it, right? You want to know, well, why was there a bomb? Who placed it? What was that person's intentions? Right? So the second level of explanation is intentional causes. And you're still looking for facts, right? You're saying that there was a fact that someone, some person had an intention to do something, therefore he placed the bomb, right? We have whole theories of agency in a sense, right? Someone has an intention, therefore they do something. So these theories are brought into the news, and the intentional cause then can be hypothesized. Now, this is a very large state space. People can have all kinds of intentions. There should be an enormous number of reasons why people place a bomb in a building, right? So part of what they do in the news story, let me just switch back to a moment just to illustrate. We listen to.
Jenna, that's right. Well, the big news coming in just the last half hour. This all happened only just a few hours ago, but in the last half hour, the police confirmation that it was in fact a bomb. So it wasn't a gas explosion. It wasn't just an accident. And also the thing you mentioned, also that there may be some people trapped here. Obviously, that did not look like the case with those initial images we saw. It looked like they're done pretty much to clean up. That really is the latest. At least one person dead. There could be more. There are certainly several injured, and you can see from the amount of destruction how much glass came out of those person dead. There could be more. There are certainly several injured, and you can see from the amount of destruction how much glass came out of those windows. The Prime Minister's building is supposedly 17 stories high. You can see how much of that was damaged. Certainly people on the street and perhaps even in the buildings were injured. Now, why did all this happen? A lot of different theories. Just last week, a Norwegian prosecutor filed terror charges against an Iraqi cleric who had threatened Norwegians with death if they deported him. Also, Norway had a similar incident to what Denmark had with the cartoons that the Muslims found offensive, and also two other things very simple. One Afghanistan, one is called Libya. That had Norwegian troops in both places. And finally, Jenna, it's too early to tell, of course, who is behind this. This is just speculation. We are waiting for some claim of responsibility. We're also waiting for a news conference from police where at least we can get some of the basic.
Okay, so you see what's happening here, right? That, there's a fact on the ground, something that we actually know, right? And then this spins out, right? And it's the job of the journalist to spin out. It's not illegitimate in some sense, right? Like if you were in that position, you would be expected to come up with something Right? Some explanation of what's going on. But you can see they're grabbing all over the place. I don't know if you remember this incident in Oslo, right? It turned out it was, a blonde, blue-eyed Norwegian made of bread that had done it, right? But all of the initial speculations are, this is Muslim terrorism, this is Al-Qaeda, and so on, right? Zero fact. But this is what the news, what occupies the news, right?
Is there a reason why you selected Fox News clips?
It wasn't just Fox. I mean, you'd be interested to see even Al Jazeera.
All right.
In the first few hours, said, most likely culprits here are Muslim terrorists. Right? It was all over the place.
It's something that you can ask now, or should we wait after you finish?
You go ahead and
Something that you said in one of the first clips before you stopped, when you stopped at the Fox News, you said it's interesting where we are being located, we are being located, and kind of made me think of the second point you made also, that depending on which news stands for, so cognitively where we are being located by the facts that they present, and whether the news is unmediated or not, also that is where Jon Stewart and those come in and they dissect the news the way it is presented.
Yes.
So that also is interesting where you immediately see such things on TV, okay, there's this blast, this other fact, and then you see these Jon Stewart-like shows that really make us rethink what we saw. So that has its place in the news too in a strange way.
Right. So if I can just a little bit. So what you get, right, is that you get an anchor who basically frames the whole event.
Right.
I can't do all of this in detail now, right? But just to say you're really on the right track, right? That there's an initial framing, and then the editor then sort of orchestrates the whole story, so that there's a whole series of resources that get pulled in, right? To, in a sense, adumbrate, to illustrate, to demonstrate that framing is the correct framing. Right? Now, what I've showed you here, these very early clips, that's sort of breaking news. They don't quite know what's happening yet, right? So they're scrambling. So what we're looking at is they're scrambling for all the different ways in which they can organize the material, right? And you see it on the fly. As soon as things stabilize a little bit, they'll come up with a story, a particular frame, and then they will, just as you said, position the viewer in such a way that story seems credible. And part of the power of television, just along those lines, right, since you picked up on that, is that it's very hard for the viewer to realize that this is happening. Right? The amount of data, right, it basically takes up your cognitive bandwidth. Right? It looks like an experience, right? And at the same time, precisely because it is so direct, it makes you, for instance, emotionally engaged from the position that the footage is filmed. And of course, that's a production decision. Okay? That's not a fact. Right? It's purely a decision of how you want to orchestrate this. So television provides this sort of paradoxical kind of dichotomy between the appearance of just pure experience. Television literally means vision at a distance. As if you're just standing there, you're seeing things back in Oslo. Right? At a distance like that. Right? But in fact, it is highly produced. Highly manipulated. Now, that's not to say that that's necessarily in itself immoral. Right? It's something that it's very powerful. So you can't simply treat it as if, television is dominated by interests who, they're not really seen as, how can I put this? They're dominated typically by commercial interests that don't really have the broad interests of society at heart. Right? They have some economic agenda or something, right? And this is a very potent tool for these forces. Now, the simplicity of television is in some sense deceptive. Right? So even though we get things very fast and very effortlessly, the cognitive processing that goes on behind the scenes is very complex. And part of what I wanted to point to here is this notion that, there's a little bit of evidence, right, that activates a complex mental model that has embedded within it all kinds of causal theories. Right? And then these are used to generate hypotheses about what may have happened. And thinkers will then pull in these kinds of resources to illustrate the hypothesis. Now, these theories of what may have caused what, right, they are really, that they're possible. They're not facts, they're possibilities. They're really theory generated. They're basically expressions of what I think the facts may mean, but I'm bringing that meaning to the fact. It's not the physical thing that you're really reporting, right? It is a really mental model. And you can imagine a kind of diagram like this. So think of it as a topology, right? Where every moment in time is a point on the surface, right? So that the whole field of the possible, everything that could be done in the situation, right, could happen in the situation, is a particular point. You're located somewhere in the possible. And when people try to reconstruct a motive, right, what they're looking at is they're saying, we are here now, right? We are at the end of this trajectory. And the trajectory is a series of actions, a series of strategically executed actions in order to get to a goal. Right? So there's some agent, right, working within the possible who has as a goal to reach a point within this notion of the valuable, right? Some goal that has a significance, a value. So when you try to find it, when you try to sort of explain why something happens in the way that we just saw, right? Glass on the street, bombed up buildings, and you try to explain it, right? You basically try to map it onto something like this. Right? In other words, you try to say someone had a certain motive, let's say, a Muslim extremist, right, had a motive to get back to the Norwegian government for supporting the war in Afghanistan. And they thought through all these different steps to get there and hurt the Norwegians. Right? That was the goal. Right? And then you have sort of explained it by hypothesizing that trajectory. But you are, in a sense, if you could imagine, each hypothesis would be a different zigzag, right? A different trajectory. And you have loads of them, right? Generating them very fast because audiences, then this is what audiences want. Right? They want what it means to sort of explain something, right, is to tell a story that has this kind of structure. It has a trajectory that goes from the possible, right, into a likely set of outcomes, right, with realizing the goal. Now, if you think of that kind of model of in the diagram, these are just flats, right? But you can think of them as sort of complex topologies. Right? Sort of maybe there's a mountain right here, so you can't cross. Right? You can't go here. Right? There is features in this map, like a geography, right? And there are certain ways where you can go, given your resources, right? Different paths are going to take different amounts of resources. So that you may have to navigate very carefully to actually get into this green area of what is actually likely, and then into the overlap here of not only possible, not only likely, but also something that is desirable. Does the diagram make sense? Now, it turns out if you think of the the next stage in the news, to put it that way, right? The news is not only about determining the facts. The news is also, to a very large extent, about determining responsibility. You can see how that links up, right, with the notion of explaining something having to do with determining the intention of that person, right? But even beyond that, right, once, in a sense, we have figured out which trajectory was, in fact, the factual one, which actually happened, right? We got enough information, after a while, right, that we could throw out the other hypothetical trajectories, and we determined what actually happened. Well, what happens then is that you, having established the fact, right, doesn't make the possible irrelevant. You might think that then, since we now know what the fact is, we can just throw out the possible. Right? But it turns out that's not true at all. Right? So, for instance, once a crime has been committed, right, in this case, for instance, someone put a bomb and then he went and shot all these teenagers and so on, right? Part of what society said is, you should not have done that. We're going to punish you because you did it. Right? Now, so what does it mean to hold someone ethically responsible for something? Right? You say, look, this is actually what happened. Okay? But that's not enough, right? We want to say granted, this is what actually happened. But you know what? It shouldn't happen. You shouldn't have done it. And since you did it, I'm going to punish you. Put you in prison, execute you, something. Okay? Or just sack you. Right? You've been corrupt. Right? We've established, right? Gone to a lot of trouble, established. You have in fact been corrupt. This is what you did, exactly right. But then we're going to hold you responsible. Right? You should not have done that. Okay? So what does it mean to say that you shouldn't have done something? And of course, it's an ethical argument. It's an argument we make all the time. But if you think of sort of, what does it really mean to say that you shouldn't have done something? Okay? So, part of what we need to do in order to determine whether ethical judgment is appropriate, right? You can think through this a little. Let me just ask you, under what conditions can you hold someone responsible? What needs to be the case for someone to be held responsible for an action that's happened? Why don't we just report the action and say, look, that happened?
Prove the fact.
Go ahead.
Prove it. Prove that it
Prove
really
it. Okay. So let's say we prove it, right? So let's say that we prove that, the state minister sold mineral rights under the table to enrich himself and his friends. Right? Demonstrate.
How is it being demonstrated? What have been used to prove it?
Well, so let's say everyone agrees, right? All the documents show it. The perpetrators admit, right? Everyone is in, perfect harmony that this is what happened. Right? Right? What does it mean to hold someone responsible? What needs to be the case for someone to be held responsible?
Violation of law or violation of moral values or
okay, moral values. But the point here is that you're sort of arguing against the facts, in a sense, right? You say, look, this happened, right? What does it mean to say that something that happened shouldn't have happened? I mean, you don't have the power to make things, not happen, that did happen in the past. You can't control the past, right? Let me give a slightly simpler example. One of the episodes within the Oslo attack I can show you this on slides, but let me just do the drawing here. After blowing up the building in Oslo, the perpetrator drove down to an island outside of Oslo, took a boat out, and shot people on this island. Okay? The police were called, and they came here, and there was a little little jetty the boats and so on. They could have taken right across, right? But they continued up here, and they got a boat here. They got into the boat. Let's see if I can show you that little clip that went all around the world. It might take me a little too long to find the other thing. So essentially what happened was that someone with a camera filmed the police getting into a little rubber dinghy and slowly making their way down here, right while this guy was killing people, right? Sinking because they were all heavily armed and there was a little rubber dinghy and they were starting to take in water and so on, right? They had to be rescued by another boat and so on and so forth, right? So they basically wasted a certain amount of time, to put it that way, right? And he blamed them. He hold them responsible. Should they be fired? Or should they be chastised in some way? What determines whether we can hold them responsible?
The result of the action.
Say that again?
The result of the action?
The result. Well, so the result was poor. It means that many people died that could have been saved. Right? So you say, look, you killed these people because you were late.
We need to find out from them what made them take this brownish route and take a longer time.
Exactly. Right? Listen to her, right? You have to find out you have to kind of put yourself in their situation, and you have to find out, could they have done something different? Did they, in some way, not have the information, even if it was in principle possible to take the boat across here? Could it be that they just didn't know? And if they didn't know, how can you blame them? Right? So basically what you're saying is, in order to hold someone responsible, you have to think very sort of sophisticated, right? You have to have a detailed reconstruction of what happened, not only what physically happened and what was in a sense objectively possible, but you also have to figure out what was possible for them, given what they perceived, what they knew, the skills they had, the resources they had. Right? And then if you find, they had the resources, they had the knowledge, they saw the possibility, and yet they didn't do it. Right? At some point, like, for instance, in corruption cases, right, you would say, look, he knew what he was doing, right? He knew it was illegal. He was trying to conceal it. He could have done something different. Right? But the whole thing hinges on you had the information and the freedom, right? It's a free will argument, essentially, right? To do something different, to act differently. Only in very special situations can you actually hold someone responsible. So it turns out this is, right? It's complex, as we discussed it, right? This turns out to be a gigantic topic of universe. Are they responsible? Should they be held responsible? How much should they be punished? Right? What were their motives for doing what they did? Right? Now, let me introduce one more time. So, what we've argued is that the possible turns out to have a really central role in news. And in part, it has a central role because people have imperfect information. And the way you fill in your imperfect information is by activating your mental model of the world, right? Where things are connected, and where the pieces of information that you do know connect to things that you don't know, would like to know. Okay? And that act of connecting what you do know to what you would like to know, right? That is done through hypotheses. Think of all these different zigzags in that topology there. That's the first step. Now, the second type is the type of reasoning that we use to determine whether someone should act different. And in Norway, this was a big debate. Right? So what happened in the end, like slowly, was that initially the police absolutely denied that they could have done anything better. They denied that they wasted time and so on. Within maybe a week of the attacks, the Minister of Justice resigned for family reasons, completely unrelated to, but it was basically humiliation, right? Because his department had failed to deliver. Right? A few weeks later, head of the surveillance police resigned because basically they lost credibility because they hadn't been able to anticipate that this man was buying explosives and so on and so forth. Right? So it was sort of very face-saving, right? Nobody got sort of publicly humiliated, but implicitly, sort of the subtext, right, is that we're not happy with what happened here. You should have performed better. Right? And of course, a lot of parents and a lot of the young survivors, I have friends myself, right, who survived and they are very mad at the police. Right? They felt the police, I mean, at a time when you're being, your friends are being killed, right? The police was bungling away in a little rubber dinghy, It was pathetic. And people got very angry. It was life and death. Now, the third type is also a big part of the news, and that is you go back and, so first you try to reconstruct the facts. And I hope what I've sort of, got you to see here is that in itself is a very complex process. Right? Second is you go back and you try to hold people responsible. You've got to have a really complex model of reality to legitimately hold someone responsible. Right? But part of the sort of payoff of this, right, the cognitive yield in the sense, right, is that when you have that kind of detailed understanding of how things are connected, you can start to plan. Right? So that your future activities, right, are now informed by your detailed examination of what went wrong. And again, you can take the Lokayukta debate in Karnataka, right, where you have this ongoing debate about who wants to have a strong Lokayukta, who wants to have sort of just a figurehead, right? You can see the sort of all the storm around that, right, ties right into this kind of thinking in the sense that the Lokayukta's job is to look into what exactly happened, who can be held responsible, and then how can we move forward into the future in a better way. Right? And now the position itself is something that gets pushed into the future. In a sense, some people want to ensure that we get a strong corruption finder, right? That's not in itself based on simply the facts, right? But it's based on this complex projection in the sense of the consequences it will have if we just have a weak Lokayukta, right? Then the politicians will get away with murder, right? Now, so I think we basically covered these. So to summarize, the news engage people at multiple levels. And part of it is the perceptual engagement. Right? And I didn't really go into this in detail, but you can see it's at the beginning of the argument there, along the lines that we were discussing. Right? In other words, the news place you in a certain perceptual position. Right? That creates the opportunity for engineering certain types of experiences where you may be placed in such a position that you have sympathy with a certain group, or you find a certain group, distant and doesn't really have anything to do with you, right? And these manipulations can be done without lying, right? They can just be done by manufacturing experience, right? Now, in addition to the perceptual level, the news also require, right, in order to make sense of the news, right, they require that you activate quite complex mental models of how the world is put together and how causal links tie different components of this world picture together. The result of that is something along the line of what we could think of as a narrative. Right? These are organizing ways of understanding the world that place individual factual events into the concept of a much larger narrative. And that narrative is itself this complex topology that can be used to reconstruct imperfect information done in the past, to reconstruct it in such detail that you can actually hold someone responsible for it and say, you saw this, you could have done something different, and in fact you should have. Right? I counted against you that in the past you didn't do this thing that you could have. This narrative reconstruction of the past also allows us to think of the future, right, as a whole series of possibilities where we orient ourselves in a complex world that is tied in to the facts, right? But that also gives us freedom to navigate within this complex possibility space of possible facts. So I think maybe I'll just stop here. Any further issues or questions or comments?
So what in your view should an informed audience do with the knowledge of this, that can portray one viewpoint and perhaps look to multiple sources to gather information about what could be the truth, but what other things could we do?
Right.
Yeah.
So I think we can think of that question both at the personal level and at the social level, right? So on the one hand, I think if you become aware of the power of this type of visual communication, in the communication of experience, where the temptation is to simply take what is shown on television as simply fact, right? It's just evidence, right? Part of the lesson from that is that, how can I put it? It's a medium that we need to treat with respect. One of the dimensions that gets pulled into this is, if you think of the ability of television, because it is treated as a kind of experience, right, to itself construct the mental models that we use to orient ourselves in our lives. So there's a theory in communication studies called cultivation theory by Gerbner, who basically what Gerbner did was study people who watched a lot of television. This is a study that would be really fun to do in India today, right? Where not everyone has been completely saturated with television yet, right? But where it's being introduced in certain areas and so on, and see what is the effect. So what Gerbner found, he looked specifically at attitudes to others in terms of sort of expectations of crime and violence and how likely it was that you would get mugged in your neighborhood and so on, right? And what he found very simply was that the more television people watched, the more likely they thought it would be that they would get mugged. Right? The more violence they thought there was in their neighborhood. Right? Not correlated with the real violence, but just correlated with their television viewing. Right? Called the mean street effect, right? Now, if you look at advertising, right? The amount of money spent on advertising in the US is still something like 3 times what is being spent in India, right? But you have lots of people in India who say, well, this is an untapped potential, and now we need to pump the airwaves full of more advertising. Right? So what advertising does, right, if you reflect on that, is they create mental models in the sense that they create links between certain product and certain states of mind. Right? And because we watch television in some ways as if we were just there, as if it was just experience, and they are part of our, basically emotions seem to work as a sort of sampling system, right? They take all of experience and summarize it in some ways. Right? So ads blast this message at you again and again, and your brain is simply trained to associate happiness with comfort. And it works. Right?
That's why I keep going back to the slide you have on mental models and how it is explored. For some of my colleagues and students who don't know, I apologize for not explaining what Fox News and Jon Stewart are. Fox News channel in US is very conservative channel, and then there's Democrats and there are Republicans, pro-Republican, and it kind of changed the whole ball game. I think, and please correct me, but you understand journalism to be neutral. But it's kind of changed in a very heavy, black and white, are pro-Republican. And they present news, that's why I asked him if he purposely use Fox News.
Right.
But they purposely present information in very one-sided way. Not that the other channels are not, but they tend to be a little bit more gray. And that is why the Jon Stewart, other show I mentioned, he's a satirist, stand-up comic, but highly intelligent. And he really decodes both Republicans and Democrats, but Republicans give a lot of food to, really have, break it down. And that is why the mental models are like some of those shows that really they see that and they make you rethink, you break it down and like what is happening here. So the mental models is exploited so well by some of the news channels.
Yeah.
And that there are...
That's right. So again, what you see is the sort of notion of, it's activated right at the beginning, and then they're all illustrated to reinforce the message. And the amount of data that's going to be thrown at people is so high that it's very hard to really be skeptical while you're watching this stuff. Right? But you're right that Jon Stewart does a good job in kind of taking this thing apart, right? And showing that it's carefully assembled. Right?
Us to understand what's happening in the also. And the other part is like such kind of channels with sensationalized news events tend to have higher viewership. And the other point I have is like in Andhra Pradesh, like the state I come from, like we have each regional party has their own news channel, and people know that the news channel supports them. But so a particular event, each news channel portrays supporting the other party. So does it have effect on the viewers knowing that the channel is owned by the other party? But does it have effect on the viewers knowing the fact that?
Right. So what my colleagues did an experiment where they took the same footage and then they stuck different trailers and logos underneath, right? So one group looked at it and thought it was CNN, and the other had exactly the same footage, and it looked like it was Fox, right? So what people would do is they would just discount the Fox, right? They would say, not credible. Right? It was exactly the same material, but they would use this kind of meta information. So when broadcasters have an explicit party affiliation, that in a sense is a kind of honest signal, right? You advertise up front that you're going to be partial, and people expect that, and then they might go to other sources to complement that perspective. Okay. So at least in the newspaper industry, I think the sort of tradition showing that that's a helpful development. Right? Part of the problem with Fox is that they say fair and balanced and no spin zone, right? There's all this sort of deceptive meta tapping, right?
That's not the problem only with the news channels. Like even newspapers, particularly in the state of Andhra Pradesh, I say because every newspaper has an affiliation. They don't say it openly, but people know it.
Yeah.
And kind of newspaper and watch the particular channel.
Right.
So,
I mean, you do have an effect here where, and this is something that, we need to go into more deeply, right? But you do have an effect where people sort of seek out a particular segment. And media get increasingly, because the cost of distributing information has dropped, right? More and more, tightly segmented groups of people have been able to sort of have their own channel, their own voice. Right? So they call this an echo chamber effect, where you have some conviction, and then you get media coverage that keeps confirming that. So it keeps sort of digging the rut deeper. Right? So one of the challenges of modern media, somewhat paradoxically, you might have thought that with the internet, with cable television, with the drop of the cost of communication, that we therefore would have, this rich, multi-perspective presentation of the world, right? And for some people, I think that does happen, right? There are people who do make use of it and really get multiple perspectives. But then you also have people who gravitate towards a particular echo chamber confirming what they already think.
Has there been any, I'm only mildly familiar with Gullibil's cultivation theory, but I wanted to know if there have been any responses to the theory which says that despite this, one's background or more access to more information makes one not as susceptible to these mental model attacks.
Right. So I think that's an interesting question. I don't think that the research is sophisticated enough at the moment to really answer that, to put it that way, right?
It would be interesting to study that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the question of, so again, part of the original title of the talk, right, with verbal skepticism and visual gullibility, is that in the case of language, we have thousands of years of training in argumentation. Right? People presenting their view and being given some credibility and being met with some skepticism, right? So we find it very easy to be skeptical to verbal arguments. In the case of visual arguments, it requires a far higher level of sophistication to understand that these are communicative acts that are being assembled by people who are telling a certain story. And that's an important lesson to understand. And I think part of what could be done in schools and so on is also to give children and students the ability to put things together themselves so that you actually experience what it's like to be a production team, convince people and so on. It's a very useful exercise. So this is the kind of sort of media literacy in the sense that we need, right, to understand how powerfully our minds are compacted. Should we wind up?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.